Hi, everybody. Welcome. My name's Ari Kelman. I teach in the Graduate School of Education, and I'm a member of the core faculty of the Taube Center for Jewish Studies. So, on behalf of the Taube Center and the School of Education, I want to welcome you to today's event, Teaching a Dark Chapter, featuring Daniela Weiner. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Daniela R.P. Weiner, the author of Teaching a Dark Chapter, History Books on the Holocaust in Italy and the Germanies. Dr. Weiner is in her final year as a college lecturer, and in the fall, she'll join the faculty of the Stevens Institute for Technology in their first year experience program as part of the School of Humanities, Arts, and Social Sciences. Her book, as you may take from the title, is about textbooks, but in truth, it does a lot more than that. And her book is also about the decades after World War II, but it also does much more than that, too, or at least the resonances of the book carry forward far beyond its primary focus. It was hard to read the book about how nations debated how to tell the stories of their difficult pasts without thinking of some of the arguments that have surfaced in this country in the past few years. The 1619 Project, the removal of statues from town squares and names off of buildings, the events of January 6, 2021. How nations tell the stories of their histories is not just a matter rendered in textbooks for school children. It's a matter that cuts to the very heart of what nations are, how they talk about themselves and their pasts, and how they envision their futures. Those pasts and those futures, she found, can only be told in relationship to other stories told by other nations. And those stories don't always align, and it's often in those conflicts that things get really interesting. And there, too, in those contradictions and conflicts, we find echoes of the past in today. So the echoes between Dr. Weiner's book and the contemporary moment are uncanny, even while her historiography remains tightly focused on the events of the second half of the 20th century. So I've said enough, and to hear more about the book, we'll let its author speak for itself. The book's author speak for herself. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Daniela Weiner. So I do have some questions prepared. And we'll start with your own background. What, if anything, do you remember about your own high school history textbooks?
Very little. Let's start with that. But first, I just want to thank the Toby Center for hosting this event and Ari for being in conversation with me. And Ari has been a wonderful thought partner as I actually wrote this book. And so I'm very grateful to talk with you about it today. So what do I remember from my own high school history textbooks? Not that much. I remember that and this is perhaps resonant with what I found in my book. I remember we didn't actually get through the textbooks very often. We didn't usually make it past World War II. In fact, I think we spent very little time on World War II. Spent an enormous amount of time talking about the Russian Revolution, but not. We really never got to World War II, and very little past. And so I think that actually resonates with what I found in the book, looking at how the Holocaust and how the Second World War were narrated in the post-war Germany's and post-war Italy. That seemed to be a common refrain that I often heard, that people did not get past certain points in the book, or teachers avoided teaching certain chapters of the book. And so this was, at least to a certain extent, I could also kind of relate to this because this was in many ways part of my own history experience.
And when did you first have a sense that textbooks were a good way to understand, sort of as an entry point into this study of history?
I had always been really interested in historiography. That had been something I would been kind of interested in and developed an interest in during my undergraduate studies. And then I actually took a break from doing history and taught in K-12 schools for a while. And when I came back to history and I started to pursue my PhD, the person who then became my advisor, Konrad Jarosz, said to me, it would be really great if you explored this interest in memory and historiography through the lens of textbooks. And so that, bringing together like a pre-existing interest in Holocaust memory that I had explored during my undergraduate studies, pre-existing interest in Holocaust historiography that I had explored during my undergraduate studies, with my developed educational background, it seemed like a perfect unity, I would say.
And can you, for folks here or listening online, can you elaborate a little bit about how the process of writing a textbook might differ from the process of writing the kind of history, like the sort of historiography that went into writing a book like this, or the books that you primarily read, like in your graduate training?
So there were a lot more people involved in writing the textbooks, I think, than writing my book. Uh, I would say. So when textbooks were written, and I worked with 3 country contexts. So I worked with, Italy, and I worked with West Germany, and I worked with East Germany, and so it varied based on, the country context exactly how the textbooks were produced, but, often there were guidelines produced by the state, and in some cases, more than just guidelines. Um, Often there were teams of writers working together, not in all cases, but often, or writers working in concert with a publishing house. And I mean, I'm not entirely sure how much archival research went into the creation of the textbooks. When I was writing my book, I spent a lot of time working with textbooks, working in archives with the papers, for example, of the occupying forces, the papers of various governmental bureaus. And so I would say probably different sources were used and also different numbers of people.
And what sort of other concerns, maybe more concrete or even more ephemeral, go into the shaping of the narrative, the historical narrative in a textbook? Just a generic textbook, not necessarily the ones in the book. We'll get to those in a second.
I mean, certainly you have there's freedom of like the author's freedom to write, and that was actually very, very important for certain countries that I studied. But of course, the state is putting forth what they suggest should be taught, or at least what they suggest, what they think are the most important, I'd say, like points to hit. And that has a lot to do with politics going on within the state, international relations to a certain extent, the media landscape. Um, there are a lot of different, and often there were a lot of international textbook commissions going on as well. So you've got countries talking to one another. And so this is all, I would say, influences that went into the actual writing of the textbooks.
And so take us to the sort of where your narrative begins. After the war, Germany and Italy are occupied by the French and the British and the Americans. How soon after the war did Italy and the Germanys begin to rework the history that was in their textbooks? Like, when did they start thinking about and sort of reflecting on, in this particular, not in the monuments land, but in this particular vein, when did they start thinking about how to craft their historical narrative and put it into the textbooks for schools?
The process begins in 1943, so before the war actually ends. And that is because, well, the process by which certain history, I would say, was stripped out. They were not writing new history to put in at that point. But so Italy, the Allies invade Sicily, and when that happens, Mussolini is deposed. There is an intermediate government. There is an armistice signed between the Italian government, the Kingdom of Italy, which was then ruled by a monarch, and the Allies. And there is some planning about basically how to revise the textbooks. They want to reopen the schools. The first place they're dealing with this in Italy is Sicily. They are trying to rewrite the textbooks, but the textbooks are heavily fascicized. And so initially it's a question of just ripping out pages or blacking out sentences or just cutting out entire chapters of textbooks that are like with really, really fascicized narratives. Um, that is essentially as far as the Allies got, more or less, with Italy, because they felt very strongly that it was important for the Italians to be able to generate their own narratives to replace these kind of excised portions of the book. And this process of kind of replacement didn't really take off until the 1950s, mostly. And so the Allies are essentially out of there by then. In Germany, the Allies took a really much more hands-on approach. And it's a story, I would say, of 4 zones. So there were 4 allies who occupied 4 different zones in Germany. The British, the Americans, the French, and the Soviets. They all had different attitudes towards how they wanted to go about helping or not helping to rewrite the history textbooks. Um, of course, and then Berlin, the capital, was divided also into 4 zones of occupation as well. Again, by the 4 allies. And so I would say the different occupying powers in Germany took very different tacks. The Americans had a more hands-on approach. First, there was the excision process, but then the Americans helped encourage the creation of new books. There was a very famous, or not very famous, but there was an important textbook project where the Americans essentially brought German school teachers to their curriculum development centers, or educational service centers, as they were called, and gave them the resources and the libraries and the hot meals and the heat, because that was all very a problem in post-war, like immediate post-war Berlin, to write a new textbook series called Wege der Völker, or Paths of the People, is my translation of it. And this was meant to be a progressive textbook series. It came out in 1948 and 1949. And this was something like a sponsored textbook project by the American government in the American sector of Berlin. Um, while the British were a little bit more hands off, but they still were having a lot of committees meeting to talk about what should be in textbooks. The French printed their own textbooks essentially for their zone, and the Soviets set up essentially a German educational ministry in their zone, and they printed textbooks from other Soviet countries until new ones could be created. Particularly when it comes to contemporary history textbooks. So they all had very different, I would say, styles in terms of how they wanted to handle this.
How did the American and the French textbooks differ in terms of their content?
So the French textbooks were, and I actually did not get my hands in any time on a French history textbook a history textbook from the French zone. But my understanding is it was essentially like a French textbook translated and reprinted. While the Americans were often sponsoring the creation of books by Germans, but with, I'd say, American resources generally. There was this group of German emigres living in the United States who wrote this textbook series that was used. Well, all 4 of the zones considered it, and I think the Americans didn't actually want it in the end, or the German teachers in the American zone didn't want it in the end. And then I think it was used in the British zone and perhaps the French zone. But no one actually really liked it. Any of the occupiers really liked this textbook series. So often we would there was a lot of discussion back and forth. I spent a lot of time kind of tracking what happened to these textbook series in the archives.
Can you give us some insight into what some of the editorial scuffles were
Sure.
around the textbooks?
I mean, that was probably that editorial. I'm not sure if that's a scuffle. There was a lot of grumbling about that particular textbook series that I mentioned. I found it fascinating because I found that essentially all 4 of the occupying powers were complaining about it for different reasons. And then there was an international textbook institute. It's now gone through many different iterations of names. I actually did a lot of my research there. It still exists. But there was an international textbook institute in Germany created in the immediate post-war period, and they put out a journal where they reviewed this textbook series, and they said it was, um, not pedagogically recommended, that it was very boring, essentially, and that it was also not necessarily, it was a very dry political history. It wasn't embracing kind of new trends in pedagogy, which would focus on social or cultural history. And so that was a drawback for them. So I guess I'm not sure if that's so much of a scuffle, so much as lots of muttering about this textbook series.
Muttering is good.
Muttering's good.
And how did the Germans and the occupying forces, if you could pull back from the textbooks for a minute and just talk about education, how did they each view, if you have any insight into how they viewed like education in the process of national reconstruction after the war?
They were not given enough resources, and certainly a lot of the educational officers who were involved in this complained they didn't have enough resources. But the Allies thought it was very, very important. And they thought it was very, very important because they thought essentially that fascism and Nazism had percolated the minds of young Germans and Italians through the educational system, and that the only way to essentially undo this damage was through through new education. And in fact, I found, for example, Guido de Ruggiero, who was one of the post-war ministers of education in Italy, or actually wartime. I think he was 1944. He says, we need to essentially bring peace to Europe. To kind of have a national rebirth. And I'm paraphrasing here. We need to go to education. Education is important for this, and I saw that type of language pop up again and again, not just from like reformist Italians and Germans, but also occupying forces, the members of the occupying forces who were involved in this educational project.
And so you mentioned the sort of concern about young minds that had been sort of bent in the wrong direction, and it was the job of the educators to to reclaim them, I think, which leads me to one of the really interesting kind of sections of the book where you talk about the swastika wave. I hadn't heard of this before I read your book, and then I read your book, and then I've now seen mention of it in a bunch of times. So if you could give a little bit of background of what the swastika wave was and sort of how it fits into the debates about shaping of the writing of history in the textbooks.
So in Christmas Eve, 1959, there was a defacement of the newly rebuilt Cologne synagogue. And this set off a wave of defacements of Jewish synagogues and Jewish cemeteries throughout the world, not just in West Germany, but throughout the world. And in fact, the country that had the second most number of defacements was the United States immediately after this. And this became known as the swastika wave or swastika epidemic. And there was a lot of press coverage about this, not just in the German press, but in world press. And it was attributed, the defacements were attributed initially to neo-Nazis, neo-Nazi youth. In fact, others hypothesized, both contemporaries and contemporaries at the time, but also some present day historians have hypothesized that in fact, perhaps it was the KGB who did this to kind of set off anti-West German sentiment and to discredit West Germany. But it did spread, and there was like a wave of anti-Semitic defacements throughout the world. And because of this, there started to be a lot of attention paid in the press and among the educational authority of West Germany in particular about what the youth were learning about the Nazi period and about Hitler. And West Germany is being pressed at this time, not just by internally, but also by foreign press organizations. They're being pressed also by East Germany, being criticized by Eastern Bloc countries as well. And so this generates a huge new attention to what exactly students are learning, and that the textbooks need to be further revised. So there was a committee called the Kultusministerkonferenz, so the Standing Committee of Cultural Ministers of the West German states, and they met and they put forth this resolution in early 1960, where they basically said contemporary history needs to be taught, and we need to also re-examine the textbooks. Now, they had actually been doing a lot of this work before the swastika wave began, but the swastika wave really sharpened both the attention and also the need, and emphasized how much these revisions needed to take place, and they did. In fact, that was one of the biggest discoveries I had when I wrote this book. Was I had been doing, I would say, the research kind of in two different silos. I had been looking at the books, and I had been looking at as in the textbooks, and I had been looking at the occupying forces papers. And then suddenly I realized that around this swastika wave, I had been seeing this big change in the textbook narratives of one of my subject textbooks. In terms of one of the books I followed essentially their entire run, I found this huge change between 1959 and 1960. And I had always kind of wondered what had happened there. And then I realized that it was the swastika wave. When I put those two parts of the research together, it became very clear that that's what had happened to me.
And so when did, I mean, one of the things that drew me into the book was the question of when and how did Italy and the Germanys even begin talking about, say, the Holocaust in the textbooks? How did that evolve over time? This sharp pivot, what characterized the sharp pivot around the swastika wave?
So one of the things I talk about in in the book, not the textbooks, is this idea of there being flashpoints. So I identified three flashpoints in the kind of the course of education about the Holocaust and the Second World War in these countries. And the first flashpoint is the occupation. The second flashpoint is this late 1950s, early 1960s moment, which the swastika wave is part of this, but there are other parts of this. And then the third part is the late 1970s with, I would say, the Holocaust miniseries and a number of other educational initiatives related to more active pedagogical takes on how to deal with this period of time. So, but one of the things I found was also that a lot of scholars have said, well, nothing really happened very much. There wasn't very much grappling with this time period until much later. I found there was. And we may have found we may have found the narratives about the Holocaust and the Second World War to be, and they certainly would be completely inadequate to our modern day eyes, but the textbooks were trying to deal with this from the 1950s onward, mostly. And so initially the textbook narratives are there's a lot of deflection. There's a lot of deflection about who was responsible for these crimes. Often it is, for example, in the case of the Italians, they say it's the Germans. In the case of the West Germans, they say it's the like a very small circle of upper Nazis and Hitler, but they don't talk very much about the complicity of the broader population. And the East Germans point at the West Germans and say it was those capitalists over there. Um, but they were talking about these things, and it was very much, I would say, filtered through the lens of what was convenient to the countries for their nation rebuilding project or their state rebuilding project, since we're talking about two German states. But but there initially, as sorry, that was the initial narrative, and then as we get to these flashpoints, there's an attempt to kind of grapple further with more complicity. And we see that as you go forward in time, that each flashpoint kind of, I would say, triggers a little bit more grappling with a broader circle of complicity.
You mentioned kind of changes in pedagogy toward the 1970s, which reflect, I think, more active pedagogy that's kind of sweeping the country. But could you talk a little bit more? Textbooks are only part of the educational story, particularly and teaching history is notoriously sort of challenging on that. But could you talk about some of those other things that were available or that teachers were trying to do in schools to kind of bring history alive, as it were, particularly in the Germany's in Italy?
So yeah, I call this living pedagogical practice. I think in the book, and this is what's really reflective of that last flashpoint. The last 1970s, early 1980s period is suddenly it's not just the textbooks. Students are see. In memoirs, we see that students are talking about memoirs of their schooling days. People say they started to watch films. They started to go. There was an increase in visits to concentration camp memorials. So in West Germany, for example, the the federal state of Bayern or Bavaria is the first to really put forth some money for schools to use to take students to concentration camp memorials, and they offer money to take students offer money to schools to take students to the concentration camp of Dachau. Um, and that really starts in the 1960s. But then when the Holocaust miniseries, the NBC Holocaust miniseries comes out, which was an American Holocaust miniseries, and then it's broadcast in Europe in 1979, the number of trips to the concentration camps skyrockets, particularly at Dachau. We have visitor records from that. And so suddenly students are exposed to film. Students can go on trips to Holocaust memorials. As there are essay contests, for example, in West Germany taking place when the Holocaust miniseries comes out, which I mentioned. In Italy, there are class discussions about this miniseries. Primo Levi, who is famous Holocaust survivor from Italy is going to schools in the 1970s, and they're publishing his works, and there's like school editions of his works. And so suddenly there's much more as we go on in time from the 1960s to the 1970s. There's much more, I would say, in the surrounding culture to support these textbooks. Initially, the textbooks are really the only thing out there except for family memories. And then suddenly there's, I would say, a broader educational landscape as we move from the 1960s to the 1970s.
Do the textbooks change in response?
No. Interestingly, the textbooks kind of take on a narrative by the late 1960s, which they more or less stick with as they go forward. The big changes, I mean, of course, there are some changes, but the narratives are pretty well set by the late 1960s.
What are some of the sharpest points of difference between the way that Italy and the Germanys began representing the Holocaust over that time period?
I think I alluded to that a little bit in terms of who the textbooks blamed, essentially, for atrocities. The Italian books are much slower in this process of talking about uh, Nazi Germany and the Holocaust, and they also tended not to talk very much about the persecution of Italian Jews, which was important, or the deportation of Italian Jews, or the Italian Social Republic, which was the Italian government that existed in the north of Italy from 1943 to 1945, which essentially collaborated with the Germans to deport the Jews in the north of Italy. So that is not really present in most Italian textbooks. Of course, there were some outliers. There are some progressive attempts at dealing with this history, but it's generally not the focus. The East German and the West German textbooks, like I said again, they had their own deflections as to who was to blame, but they're in terms of they have to talk essentially about the fact that Jews were persecuted. Although the East German textbooks have also really focused on the persecution of Soviet peoples, I would say.
I have one methodological question and then some contemporary reflections. So methodologically, it's a comparative study of these three countries, and with the overlay of the occupying forces on top of it, which makes it super interesting. So I'm wondering if you could reflect for a moment, what were you able to see by doing comparative work that maybe had you just stayed in West Germany or just stayed in Italy might have eluded you?
I think there were a few things I was able to see from doing comparative work. One was that there was a common arc between all three of the countries, all three of the states. This kind of flashpoint, I would say, schema that I just talked about. And I thought that was really interesting because it reinforced to me that it wasn't just in one country that was early engagement with the Holocaust. Often scholars will say, well, there wasn't really much going on until later in this 1970s or 1980s education about the Holocaust. And so it reinforced to me that throughout Europe there was, or at least throughout Central Europe and Western Europe, there was engagement with this, what we would now call the Holocaust. Of course, they were not using that term at the time. The term the Holocaust does not emerge until the 1970s. And in fact, even in Italy today, they don't really use the term. They use Shoah. Um, but there were kind of grappling with this, even if they did not represent it or use the same words that we would use it today. Another thing that really became clear to me by looking at the three countries together was that East Germany was in some ways a pedagogical forerunner. So we think of East Germany as like being very much controlled by the state, and certainly they was much more centralized in its educational system than the other two. And this idea of often it's represented in scholarship as well. They didn't talk about it, and there was never a discussion of the racial dimension of persecution, and that wasn't really the case either. Especially when looking at the West German textbooks and the East Italian textbooks together with the East German textbooks from the early 1950s, the East German textbooks are the most, I would say, explicit about Nazi crimes, and they actually talk about, for example, the number of Jews killed by the Nazis, and it's an accurate number. Or at least accurate for what they thought at the time. At the time, 5 million was the quoted number. That represented, for example, the state of historical research at the time. West German textbooks were not talking about the number of Jews killed. Italian textbooks were not talking about the number of Jews killed at the time, at this 1950s moment. So looking at this kind of comparative way, for me, for example, brought up new information about how East Germany really dealt with the Holocaust.
So you wrote the book. You wrote the first part of the book as your dissertation,
Yes.
right? Started much before the current moment that we're in. But it came out at a time when questions of national identity and memory are very much in the public and I think on a lot of people's minds. So, what lessons do you hope that contemporary readers can take from the study as we're trying to sort of feel our way through this moment?
Can I read a small portion?
Sure.
Okay.
You wrote it.
So this is, I would say, the conclusion to the book was written after the dissertation portion of this of kind of the research. So I think it speaks well to this question. Um, what can we take away from looking at this multi-stage 45-year process of educational Vergangenheitsbewältigung, coming to terms with the past? What can we learn from this history lesson about history itself has been written and taught? We can see that the process is long. Although many historians place the true beginnings of Vergangenheitsbewältigung in the 1960s or 1970s, we can see that from the textbooks that the process began much earlier. We can also learn that the process is often halting and sometimes cyclical. A controversy spurs popular debate and discussion on the subject. Educational materials are revised to better achieve the goals of Holocaust education. And then there is a period of quiet while the materials either do or fail to do their jobs before a new controversy is raised. This cyclical nature is particularly evident in the West German case, with reforms prompted by the swastika epidemic of the late 1950s, followed by the changes introduced around the time of Dieter Bossmann's study of the late 1970s. We can also see that the process is never complete. There will always be setbacks. Some students, influenced by family memories or other factors, may fight or fail to internalize more progressive narratives about culpability. Some politicians may advance narratives that have long been abandoned in school books. Some advances may take place for the wrong reasons, for example, Erich Honecker's decision to emphasize German Jewish heritage to improve trade relations with the United States. But education overall can help move the needle on what types of discourse are acceptable and not acceptable. School history textbooks and history education in general can serve as important tools of societal repair.
Join me in thanking Daniela Weiner.